My name is Xander Arnao. I'm a policy analyst at the Knight-Georgetown Institute. I'm going to give a brief introduction, kind of setting the scene, and then introducing our esteemed panelists. But first, a little bit about KGI. KGI is a new policy hub dedicated to connecting independent research with technology policy and design. We work on two main areas, competition policy and platform governance. And this conversation is highly relevant to both, and I'm sure we'll discuss competition and platform regulation at length. But to kick us off, I'm going to start a panel on social media with a comment on AI. In the last couple of years, we've been living in a new age of AI. People in the media and industry are telling us that this technology is revolutionary and transforming how we work, how we engage in politics, how we find information. But I think one of the arguments of this panel is that far more important and impactful changes have been occurring in the social media landscape. And so just to set the scene before I turn things over, I want to just give a brief background. So the evolution of social media has really, in the last 5 years, has really been driven by four key trends. The first is that politics has moved on from legacy media. 2024, and the year of elections that it was, marked the death of TV and radio as the most influential forces in politics. We live in a new world of podcasters and streamers like Joe Rogan and Mel Robbins who command gargantuan audiences and dominate the public discourse. The second key trend is that content moderation is changing. After Elon Musk acquired Twitter, he transformed it into X and promised to relax its approach to content moderation, introducing a new system called Community Notes. These changes gave cover to other platforms like Instagram and YouTube to change their content policies and adopt their own versions of Community Notes. The third key trend that we'll talk about today is that decentralized platforms are now mainstream. Twitter is a shadow of its former self, and tens of millions of users have fled seeking bluer pastures. This has left an opening in the market with new decentralized services like Blue Sky and Threads and older ones like Mastodon struggling and competing to fill the void. Decentralized platforms work by running on a collection of independent servers that communicate using a standard common system called a protocol. This is different from more traditionally centralized platforms like Instagram and TikTok, which operate via proprietary servers and proprietary protocols that they control. The fourth key trend that I'll highlight is that the design of algorithms now emphasizes ultra-personalized experiences. In 2020, TikTok entered the social media market with this innovative For You feed, which quickly recommends videos to users based off their interest profile, only loosely connected with their personal social networks at best. TikTok exploded in popularity, disrupting the industry, and catalyzed industry-wide shifts as competitors like Instagram and YouTube offered similar features to compete. If we want to understand these changes, mitigate their harms, and capitalize on the new opportunities they create, we must reckon with why they're happening and what they mean for society and policy. This knowledge will be key as we seek to pass laws, as we seek to file lawsuits, and we seek to adapt to the changes to the broader communications environment. For this conversation, joining us are four leading experts on the social media landscape. To my left is Renee DiResta, who's an associate research professor at the Georgetown Court School of Public Policy. At the end is Prithvi Iyer, who is a program manager at Tuck Policy Press. To his right is Sean Martin McDonald, who is a principal at Digital Public. And then to his right is Samantha Lai, who's a senior research analyst at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. So to kick us off, I want to turn to you, Renee. You wrote a really good book called Invisible Rulers. And in that book, you introduced many insightful concepts for understanding how algorithms shape the content people consume. In your telling, how do online crowds, algorithms, and influencers interact to shape the social media landscape? And how has the rise of ultra-personalized feeds like TikTok's For You feed complicated that interaction?
So one of the things that's been really interesting is that the original vision of social media was that it was going to connect you to people that you knew or people who were 1 degree away from you. So you were going to come with your existing social graph. That was what happened with Facebook. There were algorithms that were referred to as the people you may know algorithms. This happened on Facebook with friends and friends of friends. On Twitter, it was people you followed and then people they followed, a little bit more interest-based. There was a gradual way of connecting you to people who were maybe a few degrees removed, but still roughly connected to somebody that you knew in the real world. Facebook gradually began to realize that it had kind of tapped that out, and that one thing that it could do instead was push you into what it called groups, and then it could create an interest-based graph for you based on suggesting content to you, primarily rooted in similarity. This was called collaborative filtering, where your interests were similar to interests of people like you. Massive amounts of data, massive amounts of behavioral data and similarity data enabled them to make those recommendations. So you were kind of pushed off into groups, you made new friends and through those group communities. TikTok's innovation was realizing that you didn't actually have to have that connection. You didn't have to be following people in order to find particular pieces of content entertaining, as content moved much more into the video-based consumption style of sort of scrolling your feed. The vertical video style of content emerged. What TikTok began to do was just push you content that it thought was topically interesting to you. We began to then see Facebook, actually in its transparency reports, beginning to do this as well, what it calls unconnected content, going from approximately 8% of recommendations, things that it would push into your curated feed, to a little bit over 20% over the last year or so. So again, the recognition that you don't actually have to be connected to people. If the goal of the platform is to keep you primarily on site, what it's going to show you instead is just content, is just videos, perhaps, particularly videos, but images as well. So this creates an interesting and different set of incentives. The book that I wrote was, in my opinion, a book about incentives, right? How do incentives shape a system? So I talk about kind of 3 interlocking figures: the algorithm, right? The platform's kind of incentive system, which determines what you are going to see through curation and recommendation. The influencers, who are content creators, people who are, they seem kind of just like us. They're a new media environment, new media ecosystem, constantly producing content, making those videos, making those posts, making those images. They have a particular set of incentives. They need to make content that appeals to the algorithm so that it shows it to people in the way that I was just describing. But they actually also do want to have relationships with their fans, because if the algorithm isn't showing it to people, the other way that content gets seen is through the actions of the crowd, people like us, people who are liking and sharing the content. And they really establish relationships with other people in the crowd. So it becomes very much a bi-directional relationship. Whereas in prior media environments, you might just read an article in the New York Times, you might watch the nightly news, but you don't have a relationship with the person who's making that content, with that journalist, with that anchor. However, in the age of social media, you very much do. You can watch a creator's live stream, you can leave a comment as it's going, and oftentimes you'll see them respond to that comment in real time. So it's much more of a relationship-based process, and that creates, again, a sort of a very different set of incentives in this media environment. And the people who become wildly successful at shaping public opinion, at getting their content seen in the world, are the people who understand how to work that system. So the influencer, algorithm, crowd kind of triad is the thing that shapes public opinion today, as opposed to this much more top-down media ecosystem in eras past.
Thank you. I think that's a really kind of fundamental image to have in mind when you're thinking about how the design of the algorithm, the interaction of the people within the system shape the content you see. But kind of thinking about the top down elements of governing flows of content, I want to turn a little bit to you, Sean. You've written a lot about data and platform governance in your work, and I just want to ask you, where does traditional content moderation fit into this new picture? Can you tell us about the shifts in approaches to content moderation in recent years and how they've changed the broader social media landscape?
Yeah, I think that content moderation is in a lot of ways the most visible branding of any of the platforms that we're talking about. And in a lot of ways is the most intentional or editorial. So in the way that Renee is talking about cultivating these communities and then watching the interplay between their elements becomes the defining category, the defining feature of how platforms solve a sort of knowable set of problems. But content moderation is also one of a bunch of functions inside of what we think of as infrastructure businesses and infrastructure sort of ecosystems that, you know, it's unique in its dynamics, but it is not unique in the sense that we want to participate in the decisions that get made around it. So if you look at, for example, client selection and advertiser selection, that has a big way of influencing the evolution of different platform communities. And a lot of people may want the sort of community or the technical functionality, but may not want to be part of what becomes the community or becomes the content moderation that drives the character. So some of the changes that you were talking about with X, right? A lot of it became about resistance to advertiser influence at one point, and then driving out the need for a sense of shared stability as a commercial safeguard. Right. And there are a whole bunch of other ways that essentially, I think the moment in social media that we have is decoupling traditional assumptions about how we put together revenue functions and core business functions like content moderation, but also like technical stack architecture, also like data storage being valent to different national authorities. You know, I think we're starting to see that a lot of the things that we've looked at as trying to build infrastructure, becoming more modular and more of a movable feast, and figuring out how we participate in the aspects of it that we find most important, like fundraising, like how do we fund these things is an important and open question. A lot of the places that we think of as the safest spaces are the most financially fragile and are under direct attack right now, in legal ways, in financial ways, in addition to what we think of as sort of more traditional technical attacks on infrastructure. And so I think, you know, we have this sort of twin or tripartite problem, which is about building out a set of infrastructures that we can participate in fully enough to be comfortable that they evolve in the ways that our influence wants them to, that are sustainable in ways that we find palatable and are sort of positive and promote ongoing progress. And I think that are increasingly, you mentioned the difference between centralization and decentralization. And we talk about it very often in platform architecture as a polarized kind of context. You're a decentralized platform or you're a centralized platform, but everything works in supply chains, and almost everything is about devolution governance and about how we manage the relationships between those links. And so the third part of this is that we have this kind of structural unbundling happening where we think of, you know, you were mentioning like when Twitter was Twitter, it was it was a proprietary protocol, it was proprietary content moderation systems, and like, yes, it lived on top of ISPs and like subject to app store conditions and policies, but it felt like a sort of singular unit. And I think now we're starting to see, you know, Blue Sky talks about its open protocol, and that's, I think, important. And a lot of groups are trying to build on that in very constructive ways. But monetization is an open question for them. And they've taken venture in a way where they are aware that they might become an exploitative or extractive threat to the ecosystem they're trying to build. And they're open about that, which is a breath of fresh air and does not solve the problem. And so we're in a situation where we have a lot of opportunity to get in to the mechanics and restack things in ways that might restructure problems and solutions. But I think, you know, working away from binaries and working away from traditional technical and market conceptions of the platforms that we're engaging with, as well as traditional expectations of what participation necessarily looks like in these systems, the further we're getting into a much less hegemonized, in good and very bad ways, ecosystem. And so I think it's, you know, that instability and managing those transitions is where a lot of the people who I think of as deeply involved in this work are focusing.
Yeah, I think you're pointing to something really important in decentralization, and that's a big theme of what I want to touch on in this conversation. But I do want to dig in before turning there real quick, Sean. Sure. Can you just talk about like the role that content moderation has played in the business model traditionally? And you talked about like advertisers and the connection between their stake in the platform and its value creation and content moderation. Can you just talk about that and then perhaps how that's been shifting recently, it seems?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I suspect other panelists may have more direct insight here, but it's just a way of saying that very often advertisers were an outer bound on the extremism a community is able to go in any particular direction,
Mhm.
and that advertisers have tried to hold, I'm not saying successfully or even altruistically, but have tried to, hold as much common ground in the sort of tones that they invest in media products as a way of having the largest addressable market share. Right. Once you start alienating people, once you start showing up next to content that people have strong and opposition reactions to, you stop being that familiar, loved, safe brand. And so really, I think a lot of platforms relied on advertisers' sensibilities as a way of protecting or at least buffering their own internal policies. And in some ways, in substituting for developing an internal political perspective, or developing an articulable political stance that they're willing to then enact and implement in their operational decisions. So I think that the role of advertising has been to segment the audience, but it is also diversified substantially. And so advertisers are now recognizing that extreme customers are very often more valuable to them than casual customers they encounter in common spaces. And so I think we're seeing that some advertisers are willing to support very different media ecosystems than others, and maybe very different media ecosystems than some of their customers or potential customers would be. And so you're seeing a political articulation and activation through this reliance on social media, not only in social media brands, but in the brands that want to leverage social media to connect with the people that they find value from.
Yeah, and I think that's really helpful. And I think as we're thinking about decentralization and perhaps the breakdown of that traditional role, that limiting role that advertising has played in shaping the incentives of content to moderate content. Samantha, I want to turn to you and more explicitly think about decentralization. At the top, I explained that we've seen the rise of threads, we've seen the rise of Blue Sky, we've seen more popularity on an older decentralized service called Mastodon, all in the microblogging space. You've studied decentralized platforms like these extensively. What are some factors driving their popularity, and what kinds of user experiences are they enabling that more traditional centralized platforms previously failed to provide?
Yeah, for sure. So over the last couple of years, we've kind of seen this increasing discontent and frustration that a lot of people feel towards centralized platforms, be it when it comes to like its ownership, its how it protects user privacy, the moderation decisions make, the extent to which it protects user well-being. So decentralized platforms come at a time when, as kind of this alternative that promises users more choice and more ownership over how their online experiences play out. So how exactly are centralized and decentralized platforms different? I know we've kind of touched on that already, and Xander gave an excellent introduction to that. How centralized platforms work essentially is that they're walled off, they're proprietary. Decentralized platforms are different insofar as it's all just one bigger space. There are a bunch of servers. All servers that are on the same protocol can interoperate. So for example, servers that are on ActivityPub, that includes Mastodon's servers on Mastodon, Threads. Any user who is on one server can communicate with users across all of these servers. And with that protocol, we have Blue Sky, we have Whitewind, there are a lot of these different services. And if you're on one of those servers, you can communicate with everyone else. The idea is that each of these servers have their own moderation policies and that users can choose which server they want to belong to. If at any point they are unhappy with the services they're provided, with the moderation decisions made, they have the freedom to take both their user graphs and their past activity with them and just move somewhere else. So with that, it kind of gives users kind of more choice over what they want to see, where they want to be, and the communities they want to affiliate with.
Yeah, and I think that change can't really understate the importance of the rise of this more decentralized ecosystem. Just Renee, real quick before I want to turn things over to what these changes mean for society, but before we go there, can you comment a little bit on decentralized platforms? Like, how does that triad that the picture that you painted, how does that change when platforms are decentralized?
So one of the things that we're seeing on Blue Sky is the creation of an ecosystem of algorithms, if you will, an ecosystem of feeds. So users have a lot more flexibility to choose their own, meaning that it doesn't feel quite so much like a competition for a winner-take-all attention grab to win, if you will, one particular feed ranking. I'll use, myself as an example. I subscribe to maybe 6 or 7 different feeds. If I find one boring, I'll like kind of really just click a little tab up at the top of your app, and you're in the next feed, and you can see what's happening over in that one. And so it creates a sense of much more diversified set of perspectives, a lot more different types of content. The people you may know algorithm, rather than being rather opaquely recommended through the platform, is also democratized in a sense. You can create what are known as starter packs. So people who follow me or somebody like Mark Cuban can go and somebody famous on the platform, actors are on there now. You can go and you can see who that person recommends, and you can just follow the people that they've put in their starter pack. So instead of people you may know being selected for you by some sort of centralized authority or an algorithm weighted by a centralized authority, you have this much more decentralized process of selecting from among the curation, opinions of a bunch of other people. This is happening with moderation now too. So you can choose from among a variety of different labelers. I was actually looking at the number of labelers yesterday. I think they're a little over 900. I don't think that means that 900 are active, but it means that 900 are are in the experimentation phase at the moment. This is really encouraging. It means that there are people who are actually trying to create and build within an ecosystem to offer users this kind of choice. So it does mean that rather than playing within this one ecosystem where influence is accrued based on knowing how to win according to the rules of a game set by somebody else, you have this much more diversified environment where people have a lot more freedom and flexibility to move through an ecosystem differently. There are still going to be people who are more influential. There are still people who kind of come with a following, and when they say I'm leaving Twitter and I'm going to Blue Sky, of course many people go and find them and follow them. Obviously some of that is just a function of kind of a persistent interest in certain types of people or content creators in society, but at the same time it does create a little bit of a different dynamic where new voices rise and emerge and can be followed through a much easier process of just clicking in from one feed to another.
Yeah, and I think that theme of choice and variety is something we'll return to a little bit later. But now I want to turn to what this all means for us, right? We live in this new world of more decentralized, more personalized, maybe even more unstable social media. And that means a lot for our politics. That means a lot for our friendships online, the kinds of information we consume. And I think we have some experts here who can really offer really insightful perspectives on these changes. So Prithvi, starting with you, you keep a close eye on research into platform governance and generative AI for your coverage at Tech Policy Press. What is emerging research into content moderation and generative AI telling us about these changes, and how are they affecting society writ large?
Yeah, thank you for having me. I think before I sort of step into the question around generative AI and content moderation, and I just want to address sort of what does it mean to do social science research on tech right now. And I think it's really important to say that, I have been looking at a lot of academic research coming out on topics related to social media polarization, platform accountability. And I think one of the key things to note is that a lot of it is dependent on sort of the generosity of big tech platforms. Like data access is becoming harder and harder. And so with things like CrowdTangle being replaced by a far more onerous process of accessing research, with APIs becoming more, with APIs not being free anymore and becoming more. Oh, sorry, I didn't realize the mic was off. But yeah, with CrowdTangle and APIs with big tech platforms, research is difficult. So it always ideally happens with some sort of partnership with big tech firms. And I think that one of the sort of Meta 2020 election projects is a great example of such a partnership. But again, independence with conducting research is oftentimes different from independence in conceptualizing research. And so some things that we've often heard is that, yes, like big tech platforms will not intervene in methodologies and data analysis and writing out the report, but they may be involved in, say, conceptualizing the hypotheses, like what are the research questions? And so could we essentially have So it is really important to lay out that there are certain hurdles to doing research on these questions. And coming to the question of AI and content moderation, I think there are a couple of reasons why it's a really important topic to discuss right now. One is that there are some pretty apparent use cases, positive use cases for the idea of automation in content moderation. And I think Dave Wilner and Samit Chakravarti have done some pretty amazing work on this. And I think it's really first helpful to think of simplify sort of what content moderation simply is. And Dave kind of looks at it in sort of two different ways. There are values and then there's classification. So there are certain values by which you might want to determine whether content on a platform is permissible or not. And those values that determine a certain community guidelines are a sort of multi-stakeholder approach. However, classification is where there's a lot of experimenting with large language models. Like, could we use large language models, especially on the classification front? Because
Can I ask you to clarify what you mean by classification?
Right. So, for example, sort of sort of in human moderation, the idea is someone sitting in a contract workers, often in global majority countries, determining based on a policy document whether a certain content should be removed or should not. Right. And so there's a classification process that happens. And one thing that I feel really I found really interesting in looking at research is how clear are people when even human moderation, how clear is it how these definitions are operationalized? And research looked into words like toxicity. Toxicity is used often, like, is this content toxic or is this content not? And oftentimes human moderators are also not completely aware as to a sort of generalizable universal definition of these terms. So human moderation has also been affected by definitional ambiguities, along with the fact that there's a psychological toll it takes that is often goes unnoticed because they're contract workers and they often don't have the same protection. So all this to say that there are some real benefits that one can intuitively gather from sort of having LLMs involved in it. And I think that I think that what's really helpful for folks to check out if they're interested in this is the content policy evaluator, which is a sort of which are the idea that we might need custom LLMs that are uniquely positioned to deal with moderation. And also what is important is to have a policy document that is as specific as possible, because again, its specificity is going to determine the extent to which we can mitigate LLM hallucinations, etc. And I highly recommend checking out some of the work that's happened in Stanford and by other researchers on this topic. But before I sort of end, I would also like to say that there are a few open questions that research is still grappling with, and I think is also ripe for future work. And one of those same things is around addressing definitional ambiguities, because human moderators have struggled with definitional ambiguities. And I think if we aren't particular about clarifications and operationalizations, it might still create issues, even if we automate parts of the process of content moderation. And secondly, which is a much larger question around AI policy or tech policy in general, is the question of sort of equity and sort of broader low resource languages is a problem. Training data is lacking in a lot of different languages that are spoken in countries with humongous user bases when it comes to big tech platforms. So there is research to show that sort of LLMs are not as efficient as figuring out sort of nuances or subjective linguistic nuances in African languages or languages spoken in South Asia. So as we think of, because I think the promise of AI is scale, right? Like a lot of the things is like, if we can do this at scale, it helps people reduce the amount of workload or the psychological toll. And I think to achieve scale for something like content moderation, sort of addressing the linguistic diversity question, even with sort of the large language model themselves, would be crucial. But yeah, I do think it's one of the sort of burgeoning topic of academic interest that is only going to get more important with certain changes that we've heard from big tech platforms in their approach towards content moderation and their lack of sort of support to sort of traditional moderation practices.
I think that's really interesting, thinking about how large language models can be deployed to augment and expand the performance of tools that help perform content moderation. I also think it dovetails nicely with the idea that on a decentralized platform, you have a lot more control over what kinds of content moderation occurs. I wonder if there's any cross-pollination potentially there. I also I want to emphasize underscore this point about research online. I think thank you for highlighting that, and I want to talk to other people on this panel who've directly conducted that research in a moment. But maybe as we turn there, one of the other changes and implications for society is in an information economy, how information gets accessed and how it gets spread. So Renee, I want to pick up on a couple more concepts from your book, which again was very insightful. Highly recommend. In Invisible Rulers, you framed information flows through social media in two main ways: as a rumor mill, or as a, maybe not on social media, in social networks generally, as a rumor mill or as a propaganda machine. And you argued that social media represents a sort of fusion of the two. What are the rumor mill and the propaganda machine, and how you think about it? And what have you learned about them both as a researcher and as someone who has a following online?
So this was specific to thinking about the kind of political opinion shaping and how that's taking shape today. So one of the reasons I wrote the book was to make the argument that propaganda changes depending on the information architecture of the day, and the last kind of, I think, real big book to make an infrastructure argument about propaganda was Noam Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent in the 80s. They wrote, he and his co-author Herman wrote this addendum, sort of like it was after September 11th. So maybe 2011, they might have written it actually, making some arguments about social media and the kind of beginnings of infrastructural change, but it hadn't quite taken over yet. Twitter was not the thing that it became. So I wanted to write a little bit about the infrastructure and how it had shifted, basically arguing that the top-down control had ended, and some of the arguments that Chomsky had made about this very centralized control of information had broken down, and that the incentives had actually shifted. And as we had moved into this information fragmentation, the ability to put out one major mass narrative that would appeal to the entirety of the country, the thing that he was very concerned about in the age of mass media, the idea that you could mislead the entirety of the country. Remember September 11th, he was talking about the war in Iraq, some of the other dynamics that took place after that, that was actually increasingly less possible, and that perhaps we had shifted into a problem of bespoke realities and mass fragmentation, where the issue actually was that you could not bring people together around anything, and that we were instead devolving into these niches where reality in one group and reality in another group were almost entirely at odds. I think you really see this playing out in the politics that we're experiencing today. I think, the question of who won the 2020 election, right? And the very, very deep, sincerely held beliefs that take hold in some of these niche communities that are almost irreconcilable with, what we would consider reality in other communities. And I wanted to write about the challenge of that. And one of the interesting things with social media, and I'll connect this to decentralization, is that as you see, originally it was everybody still on the same platform, but kind of algorithmic shunting into particular types of groups, like what I alluded to in the beginning with Facebook recommending people join particular types of communities. For a while, it was recommending people join QAnon communities. That was actually a thing that the recommendation engine really brought people together around QAnon, pushed a lot of conspiracy theorists into QAnon groups. That was a thing that Facebook's recommendation engine was quite good at, actually. And when they realized that was a problem, they kicked all those groups off. But once you've brought people together like that, they don't just disband, they go somewhere else. And this is one of the challenges with content moderation. You can't just moderate away bad ideas because people believe them, and so they find purchase elsewhere on the internet. One of the things that is happening today is that as people are voluntarily leaving platforms, as more and more platforms are emerging, you're starting to see these divergent opinions or divergent opinion communities actually migrating to completely different infrastructures. So they're not all on Twitter anymore. People used to all be on Twitter and fighting on Twitter, or all be on Facebook and fighting on Facebook. But now we have people who are just moving and migrating to completely different places altogether. That exodus kind of started on the right with the rise of places like Truth Social and Gab. There was Parler for a while. There was Getter. Not all of these were successful, but they exist. They provided a place for people to go who wanted that ideological home. And you are seeing with Blue Sky and Mastodon, a lot of the early adopters were people who migrated because they didn't like some of what was happening on X. And so a lot of the early adopter community was progressive, was left. So the interesting dynamic that we have here is actually that those ideological divides, those divides in how we think about what messages land where, how people make sense of the world, where rumors spread, where propaganda takes hold is actually increasingly happening on entirely different architectures. I remember just last night we were, there was this news that the JFK files was going to drop. And I spend a lot of my time on Blue Sky. I was like, it's funny, I haven't seen anything about the JFK files at all on Blue Sky. Like, did this even happen? I pop over to Twitter and like, boom, there it is, And so it's just this, people are having completely different conversations, making sense of the world in completely different ways. And it's sort of remarkable to see the extent to which that is, these are actually like kind of architecturally distinct spaces now. This is something that decentralization makes possible. I think it's very interesting, but I think it does lead us to ask this question about what does this say about consensus and our future ability to come to consensus when we have such completely different conversations now in totally different places.
It's also worth saying that those conversations are getting weaponized against each other, right? And so where communities are distilling into common ideology problems, even in Blue Sky, there are now influencers from outside of that ideological community coming in and essentially speed running the problems that have stymied content moderation in every platform. So usual set of hot button issues, very common sets of tactics, and trying to sort of provoke, I think, Blue Sky content moderation into, picking stances that further segment or further become kind of political liability.
I think just one thing to add sort of to that is that another thing, there's an interesting example or corollary in India with what you're saying about sort of alternatives and the idea of sort of finding platforms that you align with. And it just reminded me of the time when there was this farmer protest that happened in India, and there was a huge boycott Twitter sort of public campaign because of certain things that were said on Twitter at the time. And it really sort of like incentivized sort of looking at sort of alternatives to Twitter. And there was one that came about at the time. It was called Coup, and like the Twitter tweets and the coups, apparently. So at that time,
Let's not get into
yeah. But again, I think that did not work. So, you spoke of some successful cases with, say, Truth Social, but sort of less successful ones as well. And the India case was interesting where it didn't work. But at the same time, there was a pretty clear sort of political affiliation for those who wanted to get onto the platform. A lot of members of government weren't sharing their sort of press releases and talking to their people. And everyone thought, okay, like this is the sort of political right sort of social media platform for India, by Indians, for Indians. So there was also that sort of sovereign tech angle, which really was also boosting it sort of. And many people thought this is going to be here to stay, but it didn't. And I think looking back, I think there are a couple of reasons which come to mind. And one of them is that you had no one to fight with. And I do think that's important to realize is that, yes, social media, big tech platforms put us in echo chambers, but we're aware that there's another echo chamber to fight with or to kind of engage with, whether constructively or not. And I do think in the case where conventional Twitter had all of this debate around what's right for India and from different sides of the story, but as that platform everyone was on the same page. And so I'm curious to know what you think of, like, is that in some way a disincentive for engagement? And as we know, engagement is super important to tech platforms, but what happens when there's nothing to disagree on? And my reading of the coup case is that worked against its interests and long-term sort of, growth and in India. So yeah, that was something that came to my mind.
Yeah, I think that example, I think it foreshadowed a lot of what's currently happening in the social media landscape. I think there's we have many different smaller options, and the question is this equilibrium durable, or will the market tip back towards one option or another? I think that's a very open question, and perhaps something that we can discuss and when we think about paths forward. Samantha, I think for the sake of time, I wanted to turn to you, thinking about decentralization. This question of decentralization of infrastructure and how infrastructure might align with the communities that you're part of, or the bespoke realities that you might have fostered. Like, you've conducted a lot of research on decentralized platforms and how they're addressing safety risks and curating their communities. What challenges might a decentralized platform face when seeking to moderate content, and what tools are have been developed and need to be developed to make that easier or possible?
Yeah, for sure. So in a decentralized space, yes, like servers are interconnected, but that doesn't mean that moderation doesn't exist. Admins and mods who run servers can still block certain users or remove posts from like their own timelines. You can, on a more extreme scale, defederate from a server altogether if you don't like what they're doing. So a lot of admins and mods would defederate from servers that are primarily spammy. When Gab first joined Mastodon, a lot of Mastodon servers defederated from them. So even though Gab was technically part of ActivityPub, they weren't able to communicate with anyone else. So there are still like there's like moderation still happens there. But there are also several kind of challenges to moderation that are unique to the decentralized space. The first one is the architecture. The decentralized space is a very porous one. You're not just moderating content on your own server, but if you are federating with other servers, you're also moderating content that comes in from everything else. This makes it really difficult to track and notice inauthentic behaviors, because if you look at like a centralized platform, they have centralized telemetry. You can tell like if there are
What do you mean by
100
telemetry there?
Oh, yeah, thank you for that. It means that you have an overview of all the activity happening on a platform. So if you see 100 accounts that are acting suspiciously in similar ways, you can go like, oh, that's probably coordinated and authentic behavior. They're posting the same thing. However, if you run one server on Mastodon, you only have access to the users on your platform. So if it is 100 different accounts spread out over 100 different servers, and you only have access to the content being posted by that one account, you're like, it's a lot harder to tell when that is happening. And that is like a security risk. And that's a security risk that is shared across the platform. So that kind of leads me on to the second challenge, which has to do with information sharing, because these are all risks that are shared. Admins and mods need to communicate with each other. Some of that already happens. It's like on Mastodon, there's the fedablock hashtag that admins and mods use to indicate, oh, this is a server you should defederate from. However, you could kind of guess where this goes, which is that like it's a hashtag that can also be easily misused. There are admins and mods who'd be like, oh, block that server, I have beef with them, or block that server, they're like doing something wrong, but people could lie. So how do you rely on these signals? Of course, there are also a lot of initiatives that's created block lists with like clear descriptors for why exactly something should be blocked, this and that. But then in particular, like IFTAS had like some really good systems on that, but IFTAS winded down earlier this year because of a lack of funding, which leads to the third problem. While for commercial services on the decentralized space, they have their own inbuilt trust and safety mechanisms. A lot of other servers on like Mastodon or on like decentralized servers in general are volunteer run, or they run based on donations. Like it's really hard to get funding for anything from like having admins and mods who are primarily volunteer, like relying on like whatever money their users are willing to give them to, just moderate their service. There's a lot of funding that's necessary for developing tools. So while there are tool developers who are super interested in this, it's really hard to have something sustainable. Like Renee and David Thiel has a really good paper on the issue with like CSAM and the moderation of CSAM on decentralized platforms, where just like everything from like compute, manpower, all of that becomes really, really difficult. So those are kind of some of the biggest issues that like decentralized platforms face. So what we need to do about this is, it seems like there needs to be some kind of coordinating effort or institutionalization to really support everything from creating sustainable funding models to maintaining tools to allowing for to funding like support for like admins and moderators. And a lot of these efforts just need to happen to make trust and safety something that is sustainable for a lot of these servers that exist on this space.
I guess, and this kind of foreshadows where I want the conversation to go, but who should be doing that institutionalization? Is that the tech companies? Is that someone else? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I'm going to throw this to a couple of different people. So I know Sean is
Yes.
doing work on Free Our Feeds,
Yes.
and Renee has a really interesting paper on middleware that really goes into this. So
Sure. All right, we'll take that as a cue. Sean, I want to start with you. You write a lot about infrastructure, and I think that this has been one of the themes of this conversation so far, how infrastructure reflects the governance that's possible and enables governance in new forms of it. So Digital Public is involved with an initiative called Free Our Feeds, which is bringing together groups of public interest organizations to strengthen decentralized social media. Can you tell us about Free Your Feeds and its vision for what a better social media landscape looks like? I'd love to hear your thoughts on how that aligns with infrastructure and the potential for building better possible governance in decentralized media.
Yeah,
media.
absolutely. I mean, Free Our Feeds is a really volunteer-led effort, like a lot of good content mods, focused on a common set of problems, which are essentially that, as we've talked about, a sort of we don't have enough diversity and choice between big technical architectures that have political implications. We don't have, a lot of times the funding model that we're talking about becomes, is it billionaire backed, individually, venture backed as a community, or government backed? And those are the sort of like three main giant sources of kind of ownership structures. And that's not great for people who want to self-determine. And so there's a lot of what is next and how do we build for it. So the Free Our Feeds project is very much about raising resources, mainstreaming the set of issues, highlighting the work of a diverse community of developers and organizations that are building lots of different alternatives, not just alternatives to sort of social feeds, but also using the AT protocol to build out other things that we all rely on as more centralized systems.
And what is the AT protocol?
Sorry, the AT protocol is the protocol that underlies Blue Sky. It is the sort of, it's the hopeful protocol heir apparent of the future. To get a little bit back though, I think that, this does not solve, like Free Our Feeds is an incredible effort of smart people trying to channel resources to do some of the things that Samantha, I think, is talking about in terms of how do we find common sources of funding to support a distributed range of new ideas and new approaches to content moderation? What are the new articulations of, how we participate in protocol design or in technical artifact design that drive things going forward? But I would offer that like a lot of these are recapitulations of the open source conversation.
Yeah.
And
100%.
that something being openly licensed actually usually makes it more subject to capital influences than not. And it's not to say that it's bad or wrong to do it that way. It's just to say that it's not an answer. It's just a very articulate question. And so I think that, we can't, on the one hand, looking at decentralization and saying we want decentralization at this tier, right? At the technical architecture tier, at the content moderation tier, but we want it to be funded in a more reliable way than that tier is capable of producing, right? So we want some centralized something that will fund, that will ensure integrity against common incursions like CSAM, problems that we all agree on, like child pornography being the wrong thing. Most of us agree on, we all agree on, the point being that, well, look, the community, like, my point is that it wouldn't be a problem if someone didn't disagree, right? And so like, the question is not like, the question is, what are those things that we agree on? And how do we invest in, through our participation in our resources, setting up infrastructures that are capable of distributing those as technical architectures, as policy norms, as community moderation infrastructures? And I just want to say, to something that Prithvi said, whether you're talking about content moderation or language translation, what we're really, in a lot of instances, talking about is the tension between contextual translation and scale of common agreed belief system, right? And we have lots of ways to culturally interpret commonly held beliefs. And so we have this real tension, and it happens at the language level, but it happens at the policy level. It happens at beliefs about what is an appropriate revenue model, happens at, what is the appropriate distribution platform or, data store of where you store your data now is, of course, a very politically active decision. And so we have a lot of how do we protect independence amidst varying scales of agreement, right? In architectures that have to live and work, that are not just write it down and then we all look at it and think it's going to be the same thing. Like these are active political decisions every time content gets classified or interpreted and moderated. And so I think that those decisions, we're past the point of those being novel decisions per platform, right? Language translation at scale is a problem for every platform that has ever existed. Analog,
Can you say
digital.
what you mean by language transition in the
Yeah,
context
absolutely.
of content moderation?
So if you go on the internet, you are most likely to encounter English first. If you go on the internet somewhere else, you may find a certain amount of that internet in a local language or a different amount of content in that language. But universal translation is not a thing. The amount of cost that goes into maintaining a technical architecture in a language is a real ongoing operating cost. And so the breadth at which you do that is a choice about how you maintain operating costs. And then the architecture that you create in your platform that allows people who may not meet that standard, but enables them to translate your content into their own context, their own language, is another political choice about whether or not you own content in a very firm way, or whether or not you allow distribution of content, past your own commercial borders. For example, in a very analog sense, Coca-Cola got to a huge amount of global distribution because they said, we care about our supply chain to this point. And then after that, the local economy takes over, whatever that is, however informal that is. We are in a sort of social media set of decisions about that. And it's why I mentioned sort of devolution as this important middle point between centralization and decentralization, is because these interoperability layers and what are the common investments, technical, political, language, architectural, that are that we can then build momentum behind and resource. But I think that to me, it's these questions just recycling and not necessarily getting to the political decisions about what we think are common cause in these spaces, and then how we resource and participate in it.
Yeah, yeah. I'll just say, no, just to your point, I mean, the idea of sort of content moderation and how to do it at scale. I think one of the things that we've seen is that that governments will figure out what they feel about content moderation and whether they believe that they can do it themselves, or whether they can do a version of it that either complements or in many ways challenges what tech companies are doing, right? So I think one of the notable examples, and was the sort of the setting up of a sort of grievance appellate committee in India as part of the information technology rules in 2021. Now, what does the grievance appellate committee do? It allows you to, if I'm aggrieved by a certain decision that Meta has made on its platform regarding content, say I've said something they think that should be removed, I go to the committee and I challenge the decision, and they have executive powers to look at and potentially override content moderation decisions.
Wow.
Now, the problem is that we don't know why content is removed. So, for example, we don't have a situation like Article 17 of the Digital Services Act that allows me to know why content's taken down. That transparency layer doesn't exist. So in cases where transparency doesn't exist and there are, as you said, sort of cultural clashes or beliefs in other jurisdictions where we think content moderation is having a certain moral fabric that we disagree with, we're going to create layers of transparency or not that differ in each country. So I do think that when we look ahead of content moderation and we talk of scale, we also have to grapple with the challenges that different jurisdictions can potentially have different ways to challenge tech content moderation. And I think that one of the things is I mean, looking at the Coca-Cola thing is like to say, you know what, do whatever you want. Like, we can't control what governments decide to do. And I think to some level, we're seeing that there's more transparency in the EU because there are there's compliance that elicited out of platforms. There's less compliance when they don't have to comply. So I do think that it's an interesting challenge to figure out how content moderation, whether AI or manual, deals with the fact that there are different challenges to doing content moderation and different challenges that can be addressed. And in many cases, like in the India case, there's government bodies to have to deal with who can literally say, we don't care, we disagree with your community guidelines and what you've decided for us, And so that also brings into the question of sovereignty and the idea is tech the sort of grand unifier. So.
I think in the last couple of comments, there's been the question about agreement and disagreement over the technical architecture, making choices about what kinds of content is permissible and not permissible on the platform. This is a constant problem in this whole technology. And so I guess that's one that many people have come up with ideas and trying to diffuse. And I want to return to maybe the problems of decentralization in a moment. But Renee, you've written before on maybe one of the ways you can resolve this tension of how do you create a universal standard of content that's permissible for a group of people. You and others at this table have been thinking about what a path to a better social media landscape looks like, and in this dimension, among many others, making social media that's more competitive, more private. What does an ideal system look like to you? And can you maybe walk us through some steps that policymakers can take in light of this conversation?
Well, policymakers is the hard part.
Or designers, for that matter.
I would actually emphasize designers. So I think moderation is when you're kind of policing failed end states, right? Things that have gone wrong that we don't like, and that who we is in that sentence and don't like. That's where a lot of the subjectivity comes in. One of the things that I think is interesting is this question of, can you curate better, right? How do you decide what you up level to people, what you surface to people is actually a really interesting question. This is why I like that feeds selection model. I like giving users more control because it provides them with an opportunity to set that, to kind of set those boundaries for themselves. Mike Masnick wrote an essay in January of this year, and he and I have talked about this a bunch, this question of like, how do you shift people's mindsets away from the sort of learned helplessness that I think a lot of us who maybe grew up in the age of social media have come to expect, that if you yell mod, someone will save you, right? And that's not what's going to happen, particularly on decentralized architectures. You are going to be responsible for being a little bit more curatorial and being a little bit more in charge of your own space. That is just the nature of what it means to be on a protocol-based platform. Something like Blue Sky does still have a centralized moderation team, but some others possibly won't. And so that question of what do you how do you make people think about the power and the agency that they have, and how do you give them more active control over their space is an interesting question. So one of the research areas that I've been pursuing this year is this question of the labelers, right? I mentioned that there are about 900 of them. Again, they're not all active.
What does labeler do?
Labeler on Blue Sky is something you can subscribe to where you can you kind of turn it on. There's several different toggles of degree of how content is obscured from your feed. So you can choose not to see content. You can choose to have an interstitial where you can click on it and then see what's behind it. You can have it labeled, these different ways of engaging with content, sort of similar to the way platforms will do remove, reduce, and form. You can kind of set those toggles for yourself at a much more granular level. Some of them are extremely granular and actually quite funny. Like you can filter out people who have maybe like a particular emoji in bio if you don't want to see, people will kind of telegraph their politics. If you don't want to see the hammer and sickle people, you can hide that, or whatever your politics are. But it provides a way for people to, yes, you can in fact self-select into a really deep echo chamber if you want to, but it gives users that power to have a little bit more granular control over their experience. Also, you can filter out certain types of content. If you don't want to see AI generated images, you can, use labelers that try to intuit that and will obscure that kind of content. Ultimately, one of the questions is like, how many people want this? How many people are using this? There's also another thing you can do with shared block lists. It's another area where people in the community might make block lists that other people can subscribe to. This too can be used maliciously. People can occasionally make block lists and throw people on there because they just don't like them. This has led to some debates about, to what degree of transparency there is in these and who oversees them and so on and so forth. Ultimately, it is that question of trust. So one of the things that we have been writing about, me and some collaborators at Foundation for American Innovation, is this model of middleware, right? Where you have certain entities that become almost providers, sort of third-party providers, and you decide, you know what, I trust this third-party provider to do that either curation or moderation for me. I want to subscribe to the New York Times's feed. I want to subscribe to my church's feed. I want to subscribe to my church's block list, right? My church's moderation list, whatever it is. In order for something like that to happen in the world, of course, it has to be like stupid simple to actually engage with this technology and to do it. So we make some arguments in some of the papers we've been writing about what it would take to actually get there. This is sort of, I think the model of open source is exactly right? It can't feel like this is an arduous thing that only like a handful of people with incredible, tech skills and a whole lot of free time can do. So there are, as this ecosystem continues to develop, one of the real questions is what makes it easy for people to use. And so some of the questions that I've begun asking in my research is, why are you using this? What are you doing with it? If you're a labeler, why are you running this? How do you think about your work? Why are you doing this for the community? I think we need to be asking people what they, what are you getting out of this, both as a provider and a consumer, to have a better understanding of what it would take to shape this ecosystem. But ultimately, that question of design is how we give people the agency that they want. There's a lot of hand waving and saying, oh, we give users more control. But there are actually certain regulatory things that go into that. There are certain privacy laws that have to be maintained. There are certain ways in which data has to be handled. So there's some complexity here and some user adoption curve things to understand. And I think, this is a ripe time. And I think several of us on the panel are doing this kind of research now. And so I'm encouraged to see the ecosystem develop.
Yeah.
So can I just offer one thing? Like, we talk a lot about these as like, a lot of the conversation about the concepts we're talking about are fixed in time ideas, right? And a lot of what is actually happening is the social media platforms that get to any kind of success then have to cope with the idea of reverse engineering, building their evolutionary or adaptive mechanisms, right? And a lot of the things that we're talking about, platforms launch in one community where these problems don't necessarily exist, but then, like, because of the hegemony of the pre-existing community, but then grow beyond that community and end up having to cope with conflict in ways that they didn't anticipate were relevant to their function. And I just think that, one of the things about—
Can you give an example, perchance?
An example of
Just that growth
yeah,
scale?
well, I mean, like, even Blue Sky, right? Blue Sky was like, they are rightfully still very surprised by how big they've gotten.
Sure.
And like, it's great. And they're doing good work. There's no knock out their work. But, when your platform goes from 5 million to 40 million in a process of like 3 months or 6 months or whatever it was, you are you have a front row seat to all of the problems that arise out of social media immediately.
Yeah.
And like small community mods, easy to maintain. Once I used to work for an organization called Frontline SMS. We were an open source messaging platform. We were in 175 countries. We were a team of 20 people. We weren't maintaining content moderation standards. We were maintaining software. But the idea of, the problems are the same in many ways, where you're having to deal with what are these conflicts? How do you prioritize your investments? Roadmaps are ongoing things. Blue Sky and the AT protocol are open protocols, but they develop them. They run the roadmap. And so if you want to like meaningfully change the protocol, you either work in concert with them and agreement to the model that they deploy, or you fork and you try and go off on your own, right? And those are still governance challenges that are not fully solved in how we manage those problems. And I think that, just to say, trust and safety are the same, right? You have trust in something until it's broken. And then your trust doesn't come from like whatever your initial relationship was. It comes from whatever your ability to interact and engage with someone, with whoever that person is. It's the ability to call up the mod, to talk to the person, to understand the reason that the thing happened to you. And that will happen every time, right? The trust and safety are time-bound evolutionary processes. Our social norms that we reflect through content moderation evolve, right? And so I would just say that yes, and to the design, it not only designed for a good version or a high integrity version of present state, but having to evolve and having to have a politics about how you evolve and embed that in the system, that feels like the level of growth and design that we're at now.
Yeah.
Interesting. I think we're kind of running against some of the limitations of decentralized social media, and I think Samantha, I think we want to turn to Q&A in a moment, so think about questions. But maybe as our last question, you've pointed out some limitations and made some suggestions that you mentioned earlier for how we can build better infrastructure. What are your thoughts on decentralization as a path to better social media? What trade-offs does decentralization of social media mean in practice? And to what extent do you think further decentralization can help solve some of these problems or remedy some of these trade-offs we've been talking about?
I think I touched a little bit on this in my last answer, but I think that the most likely failure condition that we will hopefully not get to is that right now, you have to put a lot of resources and time into being an admin or mod on a server. this is sustainable for a lot of commercially run ones with financial backing. It's really hard even for smaller teams, like when Blue Sky had to scale up, it's really hard for volunteer run or just smaller servers. And as the decentralized space grows, in order to sustain yourself, in order to make sure that your server isn't overrun by CSAM or spam or like just bad content that will make all your users go away, there needs to be a sustainable way for people to do trust and safety, to maintain their services. Because if that doesn't happen, the only servers that will succeed will be the ones that are well backed, financially backed. And then we just kind of recreate the centralized order. And that would kind of go against the spirit of the whole exercise. So I think there's hope there, but we need to do some work to get there and make sure that we can kind of fulfill the promises that decentralization offers.
All right, I think that's a good note to maybe conclude on. I'd love to maybe take some questions from the audience. Who's interested? We got a white jacket right here.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It's been an incredibly fascinating talk. My name's Teddy. I'm a master's student in Georgetown's Communication Culture Technology program. I study platforms of digital video, so YouTube and TikTok, and that's kind of where my question goes. So it's easier for me to wrap my mind around decentralized alternatives for, say, Twitter, because there are models like Blue Sky and things that have come to fill the vacuum. It's harder for me to understand a decentralized version of, say, TikTok, because it's so tied to its proprietary algorithm. So if I were to ask you all to maybe speculate a bit, what might a decentralized version of TikTok look like? What would fundamentally have to change? And what would it look like for users and creators?
Here at the McCourt School. I guess the thing I would try and pull back to is something that Renee was saying earlier about the way that we classify and look at community, social graph growth versus interest growth versus behavior growth. And I think, to the extent that we're adding granularity of filtering, granularity of feed following into that experience, decentralized models of TikTok could start to look at different combinations of the behavioral versus the social versus, opt-in and subject matter as ways to start pulling things apart into decentralization. But I also think, TikTok's not you know way more about this than I do, so I'm sure this answer is terrible. But it sounds like the primary monetization scheme is about entertainment and keeping you engaged. And so the idea of pulling it apart as an experience is a little bit anathema to that piece. And I think that, there's lots of ways to talk about what models for those devolution relationships look like, or what those decentralization relationships look like. But you have to agree that that's the monetization pathway, and that may very dramatically change what you think TikTok means, and therefore that answer might, just be like, well, maybe MySpace, right? And it's not MySpace, but it's this idea that the culture is the thing that you're talking about in a way, and I don't think that we can just go from place to place. And it may be more constructive to think of these platform experiences as like dinner parties, where like you may run into the same people, you may have similar conversations, similar interests, but they end, and you're going to go to another dinner party at some point, and you're going to run into some of the same people, some of the different people. But I don't think you wouldn't look at those two dinner parties and be like, how do we make that one that one?
I would just potentially add that I think we've seen the emergence of really powerful new recommender systems, ultra personalized feeds as a strategy to differentiate a platform. So you might see an equilibrium where you have the centralized model, but it's more powered off of the quality of the algorithm, in existing in tandem with the more decentralized services that aren't predicated off of constantly engaging you, constantly entertaining you. So you might see a both and type of situation there.
The only thing I'll say to that is but it's part of the value proposition though, right? Like it's almost like it's like most people like TikTok because it's got it knows you oftentimes better than you know yourself, and the endless scroll is alluring because of how powerful the algorithm is. So I guess the alternative to me, would it even be TikTok as we understand it? So it challenges the core value.
That's what I was having a hard time
It
with,
challenges
actually.
the core value. It could be something else, or you could call it TikTok, but would it really be TikTok?
Because YouTube, if you think about it,
Oh, yeah.
a lot of the social media experience is like the sharing of YouTube videos is what happens elsewhere, but it's not the YouTube scroll and watch experience. So these two things are kind of separate. So I was trying to think through like where would all of that processing happen, because so much of what happens on TikTok is like is the stitches and the memes, and in particular the way in which the audio becomes part of the meme. So like where does that actually live? Anyway, I'll think more about that. It's an interesting question.
Absolutely. You have a right here.
Hi, thanks for the panel. Renee, a question for you about middleware. I think it's a fascinating concept and a way to give users more choice. Of course, one of the big questions is how do you get it into the world?
Yeah.
And I've seen a couple of proposals that I'd love your thoughts on. One, I think Chris Riley made some years ago when he was at Mozilla, this idea of Section 230, right? And some trade-off that says a large platform retains their Section 230 liability protections if they open up their network enough to allow competing recommendation engines, for example, a la middleware. Another one I've thought of and seen in a few places is competition,
Yeah.
right? In terms of remedies for competition concerns, that could be one of the things. Again, opening up a network enough to allow competition. Do you have thoughts about either one of those or any other ideas about how to get middleware into the world?
Yeah, the competition piece I think is really interesting. We wrote a little bit about that in the paper. European interoperability rules also potentially open up some interesting doors as platforms try to think about how they comply there. That is, we sort of picked up the middleware work from Frank Fukuyama and the Stanford kind of working group on platform power, in part because the other option is you try to give people a taste through the decentralized experience and then create demand. There's also an interesting argument to be made that as we have seen, Mark Zuckerberg's made pretty clear that he doesn't want to be in the content moderation business, right? Nothing would make him happier than finding a way to exit. And so maybe that realization, this has led to the launch of community notes, for example. Maybe it leads to the realization that other forms of devolving control to community in other ways and incorporating in middleware providers for something like, Block Party comes to mind, right? Some ways to outsource, if you will, or bring in other providers to do some of the work that they don't want to do anymore might solve that problem of both placating the US regulatory, or US political ecosystem, kind of meeting it where it is right now, while also kind of checking the boxes for Europe, while also giving his user base what they want to see. So maybe there's some demand shifts that happen there that lead to a reconsideration of kind of narrow opportunities for the introduction in a centralized platform.
Before we take the next question, can you expand on community notes? That's something that I wanted to touch on in this conversation. I don't think really got brought up. So,
So
and can you just expand on how it's changing content moderation and the reliance on it versus maybe more centralized approaches?
So community notes provides an opportunity for anybody to go and annotate content. So YouTube has a pilot on this front. X has had a pilot on this front for a while. They began it as a program called Birdwatch prior to Elon buying the company. And Zuckerberg has just announced a rollout. You can go sign up for it now. It'll be on Threads, Instagram, and the Blue app. The idea is that you can harness the wisdom of crowds to make people want to go and annotate content to say, hey, no, this isn't right. No, this needs more context. I've been I was using notes on X back in the 2022 election. What you could do is you put up your note, you say, this needs some more context. You can vote on notes. In fact, you have to vote on notes to establish yourself as kind of a community member in good standing. When you vote on notes, you are voting on things like, is this written in fairly neutral language? You don't want it to sound, particularly political, maybe. Is this a good source? Is this clearly stated? Does this need a note? Or is this, something that is just somebody's opinion? So there are a variety of different questions that go into that voting process. there is what's known as a bridging algorithm. So if a certain number of people from what the bridging algorithm intuits to be divergent political leanings both agree or all agree that a note is worthwhile and worth putting up, then the note appears on the content. So the note has to first be written, then be voted on, then clear this threshold, and then it appears on the content. And then people can continue to vote on whether it should be on the content after it appears. So there's this process. So this is, I think, overall a generally positive thing, a thing that it is good for platforms to offer. It does, again, harness that wisdom of the crowds. Fact checking is the alternative, which is a much more centralized process. Fact checking also, though, has very valuable contributions, right? Journalists can do things that your ordinary person kind of sitting on the couch writing a note cannot. I see these two things as complementary. However, the delegitimization of fact checkers for vast swaths of particularly the political right means that community notes is seen as having a higher degree of legitimacy among particular audiences. This is the thing that Zuckerberg alluded to when he said that in the United States, they are killing the fact checking program and moving to community notes only. The problem with community notes is that, as I articulated, that sort of multi-stage process means that most notes take approximately 12 hours before they actually clear, if they clear. I am a little bit sick today, and I'm trying to remember the exact stat of how many show up. I think it's like 12% or something. Yeah, it's a fairly low percentage that clear, and then they take, no, it's 12 hours. I'm trying to remember the exact percentage. It's a fairly low number that clear with a much longer time horizon than you would think. And so there's a lot of questions around, like, how do you speed that process up and make this more efficient? So I think it has a lot of potential. It's just a question of how do you make it solve the problem of getting users more information in a shorter time frame.
I just want to quickly just say one thing about community notes, which is everything just apart from sort of along with what Renee said, is that there's also a sort of general social media question around those who lurk and those who engage, right? And so when community notes exist in and of itself, some people are also concerned about the proportion of the people who access social media who are actively going to get into the process of engagement. And so there's some like preprint work that suggests that it's a really small subset of people that end up doing this sort of participatory work because it involves a certain amount of buy-in and not just kind of looking at social media from the outside. So there is also a sort of like concern around maybe the lack of heterogeneity of the groups that are going to engage in notes and to what extent.
I think it's worth also saying that all of these are businesses, like all of these have opportunities. And I'm not saying they're good businesses, but like recognizing the financial incursion and relationships is an important part of it. And I say it primarily thinking now of, like, I used to work with an organization called Medan, and Medan provides software tools to, generally speaking, very recognized journalism outlets who then implement a lot of the sort of distributed fact-checking, like when the fact-checking program existed, implemented a certain amount. And look, no one's suggesting that the work that has been done in that space is perfect, but interacting with major AP, like Agence France-Presse, like Thomson Reuters, large journalism outlets, meant that there was both a traceability and a sort of, I don't know if it's expertise is the right way, but to describe it, but a sort of procedure in a supply chain focused on the integrity of that information. So it's the duality, a lot of the duality or the complementarity that Renee is talking about with, we need experts, we don't have to trust experts, but they should be contextual, and then mirrored with community notes or against community notes. It creates a lot more of the legitimacy around, multiple layers and multiple incentive structures. And what we find in a lot of the things that, like the Trust Edelman Barometer, I don't know how many of you all read it. It is, watching the headlines is like watching someone lose hope. You just every
what is
year,
the barometer?
like,
Sorry.
the Edelman is an advertising industry firm, and they every year do a global survey of how much we trust different kinds of institutions culturally, both domestically and internationally. It has been essentially falling off of a cliff for many years now. It's kind of like the press freedom indexes. It's just the titles are a lot. But what the barometer does constructively point to is that essentially the highest trust environments are those where there's parity between different institutions of power. So you might not trust the government, but if you trust nonprofits and the government and media, and they all seem like they're working in some level of equality, then you trust the ecosystem more than you would trust any individual institution. So individual institution trust is down, collective equity is up as a theory of trust. And I think that that's, where we're seeing in community notes and in programmatic fact-checking programs, the more you can build that parity and equity, it seems like the more you get a high quality output. But you still, but timing will always be, it feels like a huge challenge.
Let's take a question here.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Iverson Yu. I'm a first year CCT student at Georgetown University. And I want to comment on the new sort of novel approach community note. Because last semester I have a class, free speech and global internet. We're trying to discuss how to transform the Wikipedia's approach into social media. So I think like community note use the intelligence of a community to do fact checking is definitely a trend to combat disinformation, but it also has a challenge. So I have actually two questions, and one question is for Samantha. So you mentioned like those non-commercial institutions, they are struggling with making compliance and the cost of like a lot of immense cost. So I'm trying to think, is it possible we have a different requirement toward like non-commercial institution and ways the commercial institution, like for example, like what digital services they are doing. They talking like this very large online platform, they have more strict requirement, but towards some like small business or small institution, they have different sort of more loose and restriction. I'm trying to think, is that possible? And my second question is regarding recent the shape of transatlantic relationship, like the sort of conflict between United States and EU, and like sort of Vice President J.D. Vance's speech on unique security conference, sort of strongly vocal on opposing the European approach on free speech and the censorship and content moderation. I'm wondering this sort of shaped transatlantic relationship will impact the landscape of social media, or the Europeans' approach in governance social media, or United States high-tech company to as compliance with this request. Yeah, that's my two questions. Yeah, thank you.
I can take the smaller servers question first. So yeah, right now right now a lot of regulatory frameworks just don't really apply to the decentralized space, or we aren't really clear on how it's going to apply. When I was referring to kind of like the ways in which like non-commercial smaller servers are struggling to comply, it's not just on a regulatory standpoint, but on a usability standpoint. Like right now, there are a lot, like if you have like child sexual abuse material, like a lot of smaller servers don't have, hash and match like capacity, like all of that doesn't really, it kind of exists, it doesn't really exist right now. And if you have a server flooded with child porn, you're gonna get in trouble. It's not good. Most of your users, hopefully all of your users wouldn't want that. So it's not a question of kind of like lowering regulatory requirements. It's making it possible for someone to even handle a lot of these problems. Like same issue with spam bots. Like if you like on a lot of Mastodon servers right now, if you get like 300 spam bots, you have to remove them one after the other. Like that's not sustainable. And for users who are on those services, it's definitely not an enjoyable experience. So it's kind of, I think a lot of the biggest issues is that we just have to have better tooling and better support, especially as space grows. And a lot of these problems will continue to grow in scale. And I'll leave the regulatory one to other people on this channel.
No, I think I can't speak to sort of the entirety of your question, but one of the things I'd say is that it's a bit interesting, and because a lot of it seems like in many cases that things that are happening, say with the Digital Services Act, might actually help with some of the some of the demands that currently we see the government having. So for example, this FTC inquiry into bias into social media platforms, one way to know if they're biased is to be able to access their data, right? And you could do that under, say, Article 17 of the Digital Services Act. So there is an interesting case to be made where maybe sort of certain as you call it, rhetorical disagreements, or may actually be impeding sort of interests that might actually benefit the United States as it sees what it wants from accountability with tech platforms. So especially in the case of the FTC inquiry, it is kind of interesting to look at that and see that exactly what you would like to have would happen if you had an EU style law in place. But again, that would be anti-ethical to some of the sort of like more rhetorical geopolitical complexities, which I'm not an expert in, but yeah.
I think that there's like, specifically transatlantically, there's never been a legal regime that held water. So Max Schrems, who you may or may not have heard of, is a European citizen who just consistently kind of keeps knocking on the door and asking, like, is this legal really though? And everyone says, no, not really. And that's happened twice. And then, you know, we've had not materially cured the things that were wrong with those agreements. So what we have is a tremendous, to my mind, is a tremendous fallout of trust. And so there's and trust being very loose here, but there's a nationalism and a regionalism that we'll see take over, right? I think this morning the EU announced, or sometime recently, the EU announced $500 billion or euro for their Eurostack initiative. And will very likely build out, you know, digital public infrastructure, not terribly different than the way that India modeled and is now being adopted at large scale throughout the world. But that kind of nationalism, I would offer also, we are in a moment where that kind of nationalism is maybe something in the US we would reflect upon. Huge political changes also affect the capacity that is conferred through those infrastructures. And so a Eurostack, if you know, Viktor Orban becomes more of a leader, would be very different than if, you know, other political regimes were more of a leader. And so I think that like rooting it in economic nationalism is very likely to continue to happen and gain speed, but is not necessarily likely to produce more good solutions to the problems that we're talking about.
I think we have time for one more question, maybe a brief one. Okay.
Hi, thank you for the panel. I was like, as a computer science student, I'm really interested in how exactly you're trying to provide incentives for technology companies or like people creating software to actually be implementing all the tools and support that you guys are describing. I think that right now with our government changes, there's a big lack of technical capacity that the government can provide. So in what ways can we incentivize technology companies when right now there's not really much of that?
For your Pete's question.
That is a very good question. I don't think that there's no immediately obvious available answer. There are a lot of people trying to like gather together pools of capital large enough to make a capital difference. What I personally believe is that there's a lot of value to being strategic about the way that things are unbundling. So when we look at protocol maintenance, you know, the Linux Foundation coordinated, and no one would say politically perfectly, I think, but coordinated the development of Linux as a multi-contributor project for a long period of time. Wikimedia, again, not perfect in any stretch, but a large, curated, complicated product that has been stewarded. And so their product is that governance and that stewardship. And I think that what we're seeing is that at the AT protocol level and in a number of other places where there are really exciting opportunities, you know, we have the technical openness, the technical opportunity to be building in those spaces. But what we have to start doing is hinging things like financing vehicles, you know, seed round developer funds into channeling investment in those protocols. So for as long as Blue Sky owns essentially the development roadmap of the AT protocol, everyone else is still riding shotgun in their car, right? And so thinking about how do we build the roadmap planning process for the AT protocol by financing, you know, Rudy Fraser and others have built alternative structures to Blue Sky. They all will have features they want the protocol to support and prioritize, and hopefully resources to bring to those conversations. So I think where I see real opportunity and incentive is channeling the value of common cause in some of these alternative models. For the big tech companies that have established investor bases and business models, you're fighting a lot of entropy. I'm not saying incentives won't work at all, but I'm more hopeful and focused on how you build out, you know, common governance and contribution models for core technical components, and then how we make those available to Stack going forward.
All right. I think that's great. This conversation has featured discussions of decentralization, creating incentives to build capacity. What role could policy play? What are some of the risks and changes that we've been seeing recently in social media? Let's give our panelists a round of applause, please.